Okay, let's start. So I guess you know that homework 2 is due today. And homework 3 is going to be released tonight. What I can promise is it's the last problem set that really has a significant experimental or programming component. So I don't know, maybe you're glad to hear about it, maybe not. I know that there's quite a few of you that started to work recently on homework 2 and have a lot of questions. Any important issues that we should talk about? No. Okay. No questions. Okay. So one apology, which is quite important. So it turns out that the evening lectures, none of them were recorded for different mistakes in the chain. So I'm really sorry about it. How many of you did not attend any of the Thursday evening lectures? Okay, quite a few. So, okay, so first, there are lecture notes from last year. The audio, the video signal is there from last year. It's on the web page. Let me know if you don't find it. It's relatively the same, not exactly the same. We'll see. Maybe I'll record another one. But really something that was out of my hands. I mean, can't do more than just ask that people will record it. So I'm hoping this one is recorded. So I'll remind you where we are. So what we did the last couple of meetings, we talked about online algorithms. Specifically, we talked about these two families of algorithms, perceptron and winnow, or more generally, additive learning algorithms and multiplicative learning algorithms, with these as the representatives. And there is a problem here. You should tell me. Okay, I think that's better. And we actually analyzed the algorithms. Perhaps not the most general analysis possible, but something that gives you an idea of how to do this analysis, and eventually gets at mistake-bound analysis, showing that these algorithms actually are mistake-bound algorithms, and with pretty interesting mistake-bound. So I'm not going to go over this now. This is one thing we did. We then extended the algorithms a lot in different directions, talked about how to extend perceptron so that it's really a solid, actually a very, very good algorithm. In fact, in terms of the linear algorithms that we've seen, the full-blown version of perceptron, when we talk about average perceptron, it's competitive with all other linear algorithms that you can find, and some of them that we'll talk about later support vector machines, for example. We talked about winnow and also talked about some extensions, including talking about a little bit noise, kind of getting some intuition for why does a learning algorithm tolerate noise. And at the end, we talked about kind of a general perspective of how we can place this linear learning algorithm in a more general context as stochastic gradient descent algorithms. This allows us also to extend and add another family of algorithms that we called Adagrad. We basically show that once you have a stochastic gradient descent algorithm, it doesn't matter which one, you can change a little bit the update rule such that it's adaptive to the rate of changes in individual features. And we did it specifically for the gradient descent version that gives perceptron, the one with hinge loss. And in fact, this is what you're going to do also in the next problem set. You're going to essentially implement, this is going to be one of the algorithms you'll implement, and you'll experiment with this. Okay, so, and the last thing we finished with last time is starting to talk about comparison between algorithms. And how can we talk about it? And we talked about it mostly in terms of generalization abilities. We gave some quantification. At the end, we finished with a graph like this. This really answers the question, or at least it's one perspective of answering the question that was asked, which one is better? So really, this answer is impossible to answer because it depends on what is the function space you care about. Of course, we are talking about linear functions here. It's a very expressive space, but within this linear function, what do you expect the target functions are? Specifically, we quantify this in terms of sparsity of the function space. How many, for example, how many of the features are really important to the target function? And there are several ways to write this mathematically. And also the sparsity of the feature space, the instance space. How many of the features are actually on in a given example. And we showed that algorithms vary along these dimensions. And this is one example of what you might see where, as a function of n, which is the dimensionality, this is my x-axis here, I'm fixing a linear threshold function. The interpretation here is n is the dimension. There is a set of 100 important features. The rest are just unimportant, completely irrelevant to the function. And the function is 1, if and only if at least 10 out of these important 100 are on. Now, as you can see, as n grows, this function space becomes sparser and sparser. And this is the type of performance you will see in terms of cumulative number of errors. We know is going to behave much nicer than perceptron or SVM that scale linearly with n. Of course, you can change it according to the analysis that I showed the slide before and make perceptron behave better. What you're going to do in the next problem set, in fact, is play with 3 algorithms, or 5 algorithms, actually 2 versions of perceptron, 2 versions of Wino, and other grad applied to perceptron, and you will try to plot graphs like this for the type of functions and data that we're going to generate for you. Yes? Okay, that's a very good question. How do we know that it converges? So that's actually always a good question, even if whether you know that the function is linearly separable or not linearly separable. Someone has asked this question last time. So you'll have to come up with some criteria or some criterion for what does convergence mean to you. And it could mean multiple things. We're going to make a suggestion in the context of the problem set. But you can say that you're going to set aside some data set for which part of your training that you'll set aside, you know the labels for, and you will see how does your learned hypothesis behave on this set aside data set. If it stops making mistakes, or at least stops changing, or its performance doesn't improve anymore under some definition of improve, you can decide to stop. So you will always have to make a decision like this. And as I said, in the context of the problem set, we're going to make one suggestion for how to do it, not necessarily the only one possible. Yeah? Okay, very good question. So, in fact, you will try it in the problem set. So what is 10 here? 10 here is the number of on bits that are important for this to be a positive example. Now, I didn't tell you here what were the examples, right? But I could give you here various types of positive and negative examples that will significantly modify the behavior here. For example, I can give you all the positive examples are going to be, all the negative examples are going to have 9 on bits out of this 100. And all the positive examples will have 11. That's one option, right? So the examples, the positive and negative example are very close together. It's going to be hard to learn. On the other hand, I can give you negative examples that have 1, 2, 3 on bits, and all the positive example will have 98 on bits. Much easier to learn. This is going to have impact on all algorithms here, right? So I didn't tell you what I did here, and in fact, I don't remember what I did here. But you will play with this in the problem set, and you'll get some intuition. Other questions? Yeah.
So we need to choose a number of 9 ones in the negative and
So you're asking about the selection of examples here.
yes.
So this is just a simulation, right? In real life, you don't have control on how the positive example look and how the negative example look, right? So someone generates examples and your algorithm learns. What I'm doing here is I'm just showing you that as a function of the type of examples your algorithm happens to see, the behavior might be different. And as we showed in the previous slide here, if you look at this more carefully, what I argued is that, for example, if it so happened that your instance space is such that very few examples are on, so this is extreme scenario number 2, then perceptron is going to do very well. On the other hand, if it so happened that the examples are dense, keeping everything else the same, the examples are very dense, a lot of bits are on, then Winnow is going to do better. And the same kind of dichotomy exists also when you change the target function. So again, this is something that is not under your control in a given learning problem, but it's important to know that different characterizations of the learning problem and the instance space is going to yield different preferred algorithms. Okay, so all we are doing here is just trying to understand the kind of the scope of what's out there and why I cannot answer the question which algorithm is best. It's a long answer to this question. Questions? Okay, so what I want to do today is I want to add one more dimension to comparing algorithms. So we talked about generalization, and I want to talk about efficiency, or some aspect of efficiency. So what is efficiency when we're talking about linear learning algorithm? Essentially, all we do in each step is just we compute a dot product. So the efficiency is going to depend on how long are the vectors we have to compute dot product for, which means the dimensionality, how many features we have. So the scenario we always are imagining is that there is an instance space of k features here, x1 to xk, but this may not be the real feature space we're going to work in, because in order to allow ourselves to learn with linear functions, we're going to increase dimensionality. We're going to transform the feature space into some other functions. I'm going to call this here chi1 up to chi n, where n is typically much, much larger than k, and we're going to learn in this new space. So we're going to pay more because the dot product on this space is going to be more expensive than the dot product on this space. So the nice thing about additive algorithms that does not exist for multiplicative algorithm is that they allow the use of kernels, which really is a trick that allows us to live in this space, the high dimensional space, without incurring the cost of living in this space. You will still do the dot product here, but really have the expressivity of this space. That's what we're going to talk about today, how to accomplish this. And of course, this is going to have implication on efficiency, but we'll see as we get to the end of today that there is some trade-off here. Okay, so what you have to keep in mind is this example that we started with in the introduction. You have data points. You want to separate blue from red. You cannot do it using a linear separator in this space, and therefore, but you can do it with a more expressive function. Therefore, you're changing your feature space, and in this case, I'm moving to x, x squared, and in this space, I can separate it. Perhaps a more interesting example is this example, where I have blue points and green points. The green points are the positive example, so my concept here is defined using this circle, right? So f of x is 1 if and only if x squared plus y squared is less than 1. And I want to learn this concept. So the protocol is going to be, you're going to get examples that are green, you're going to get examples that are blue. I'm going to tell you that these are blue and these are green, and eventually you want to learn a concept that separates green from blue. And the question is how to do it, and moreover, how to do it with a linear separator, with a linear function. And you can see that you cannot do it. And the trick is going to be to change, to transform the data. When I give you x, you're not going to send this x to your learning algorithm. First, you're going to compute x prime, which is going to be, for example, this, x1 squared, x2 squared. In this space, the data is linearly separable. Okay? That's the trick. That's what we're going to do today, only that we're going to do it in a slightly more involved way, and we're going to introduce what we're going to call a dual representation, and in this dual representation, the notion of kernels and the kernel trick. Okay, so let's go back to perceptron. This is the algorithm. Two things to note here. One is I've written it in a slightly different way, you can see here. Instead of just writing wi xi, I'm writing wi xi of x. I didn't change anything. Really, xi is a function of x. I'm just making it explicit. Xi is the function of x that takes its ith dimension, right? I didn't do anything. But it's good to remember it because I'm going to use later more sophisticated functions here. The other thing you want to remember about perceptron, I'm talking now about the Boolean case, is that perceptron computes a dot product. If it makes a mistake on a positive or negative example, it adds or subtracts 1. But it does it only in the case of a Boolean feature space if xi is on. If xi is off, I don't touch the weight vector, right? I don't change the weight vector. That's also good to remember. So let's imagine the following scenario. I'm starting with w as my initial weight vector, and I'm getting the following sequence of examples, these 4 examples. And let's assume that among these 4 examples, I actually made mistakes on x1, x2, and x4. What's going to be the resulting weight vector? What does perceptron do? Perceptron starts with w. If I made a mistake on a positive example, what's the new w? If I want to write it as a vector, I don't want to, here I wrote it for each coordinator separately to remind you of this idea, that if xi is 1, you add something, if it's not, you don't. But if I want to write it as a vector, what do I add to w? I add x, I add the example, right? It so happens that the zeros don't change w. But I really added x. So what's going to be the new w? It's going to be this, plus x1 plus x2 minus x4. Okay? So W's, the weight vectors in perceptron, are just a sum of the examples, some linear combinations of the examples. And in a more general way, I can write it this way. W is a sum of examples, where the coefficients here is y, which is the label, plus or minus 1. Alpha I is just a constant that tells me how many times did I make a mistake on xi, because it could be that I made 7 times mistakes on xi. I'm going to add it 7 times or subtract it 7 times. And R is just a learning rate for perceptron. I'm going to disregard it later. Okay, so that's what we get. So that's W. And that's going to be, okay, again, this is, that's going to be what we're going to call a dual representation, representing the weight vector, which is our target function, in the example space. Very simple. Now, it's important for us to know that I don't care really about W. I care about the predictions made with W. So I care about the dot product, W dot product with X, and I can write it this way. I just took this W, dot product with X gives me this. So it's essentially this linear combination of Xi dot product with the X I care about. When I want to predict on X, this representation says what you have to do is you have to dot product it with Xi over all Xi's on which you made mistakes. That's essentially what it says, right? Okay, so now what are we going to do? We're going to run this perceptron this way, and we're going to develop a method that allows us to do this over a very large feature space, where the key idea is going to be that computing this dot product is not going to cost us the dimensionality, but rather we're going to do it in the original feature space. It's important to notice, because it's never written in textbooks and in papers, that this only pertains to efficiency. It doesn't change anything in terms of your generalization, because the function you're going to compute with the trick is going to be the same function you're going to compute without the trick. Nothing changes. The only thing is that I'm going to compute it in a more efficient way. So another thing that is important to notice is that kernels were popularized by SVMs, support vector machines, but really many other algorithms can support kernels. And this is why I'm teaching it in the context of perceptron, because just that you'll see that, the important thing is you can run in the dual, and therefore you can use kernels. Okay, so let's start doing it. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to blow up my feature space. So instead of doing it in this xi of x, I'm going to blow up my feature space now. We're talking about a discrete feature space. Instead of just x1 up to xn, my new feature space is going to be all the conjunctions over x1 up to xn. I'm going to call these conjunctions monomials. And my space, my new feature space, is going to be the set of all monomials over x1 to xn. Okay? So now my linear function is going to be over this space. So this is my linear function. What I did is it's a sum wi ti of x, where ti is one of these many monomials that we have. How many monomials? 3 to the n monomials. I have an exponentially large feature space. Just to make sure we understand this notation, what is ti of x? If ti is this monomial, x1 and x2 and x4, when I do product, I mean end, of this example, is going to be 1, right? Because x1 is 1, x2 is 1, x4 is 1. x3, x4 of the same example is 0. And x1, x2, x4 of another example here is also 1. Just, okay, so what am I going to do here? So I increase the expressivity by a lot, but I also increase the computation a lot, right? So I can run perceptron and I can also run Winnow on this new space, or the TA space. Of course, everything is going to suffer, because if you remember the mistake bounds, they are a function of the dimensionality. Now they're going to, instead of being a function of n, they're going to be a function of 3 to the n, too large. And of course, every example is going to have an exponentially many elements in it, and I'm going to have to maintain 3 to the n weights. That's where the inefficiency comes from. So an explicit example, if the function that separates here is this function, in the new space, I can name these y's. I have, let's say, my dimensionality here. Well, what you see here is up to 5. Let's say it's n. In this case, all I allow is just conjunction of size 3, so it's only cubic in size. If I allow all the monomials, it's going to be exponential in size. Either way, in the new space, what I have is a simpler function. Okay, so now let's see how we can compute this in the dual space. So we'll consider the value of w that I'm going to use when I make predictions on a new example. As we said before, every mistake, I'm going to add the example, which means it's going to be an additive contribution of plus or minus 1 only if t of z is 1. So really the value of w is determined by the number of mistakes on which t was satisfied. More specifically, let's write it explicitly now. So let P be the set of examples on which we promoted. D, the set of examples on which we demoted. M is just the set of examples on which we made mistakes. And what I can do is I can write this function this way. It's sum over all my monomial space, my feature space, of I'm adding 1 when z, the example, is in P, and TAZ is 1, and I'm subtracting 1 when it's in D, and T is 1. And I'm multiplying this by Ti of x. Just rewriting it, I'm going to call S of Z. I'm going to denote, it's going to be plus or minus 1, depending on whether I'm in P or in D. And this is just a rewrite. This is just TIZ. If it's 1, it contributes something to the sum. If it's 0, this element will not contribute anything to the sum. And this is just rewriting it. So now I can reorder. I can take this element, change the order of this sum over M with the sum over the feature space. And what I get is sum over M, all my examples on which I've made mistakes, of S of Z, plus or minus 1 is written here, sum over I of TIZ, TIX. So what is the sum over I, TIZ, TIX? Really? It's really the dot product in the T space between Z and X. So let's just write it. So this is just saying in words what's happening here. But I'm going to call this, give it a name, this dot product in the T space. So what has happened here is I took Z, which was an n-dimensional vector. I wrote it in the T space, in the 3 to the n-dimensional vector. And then I did the same thing with X. And I computed the dot product in this T space. OK? Took me a long time to write it, but it doesn't matter. I'm going to denote this as K of XZ, which is the kernel computed on these 2 points, X and Z. So now it gives me the standard notation. Instead of writing it this way, f of x, I'm writing f of x as this. The sum, plus or minus 1, kernel of xz. Right? So notice, this is sum over all z's that I'm using in order to compute the value of the function at point x. Right? So x is what I care about. And in order to compute f of x, I'm looking at all the z's that I've seen in the past on which I made mistakes. And this is the linear sum that I'm computing. OK? So far, I haven't done anything. Right? I just did some algebra, and I've rewritten things in a different way. So what is this representation giving us? So far, you can say nothing. it's important to think about this as a distance, if you want. Right? So this is really a distance function between x and z. Every time a dot product you can think about as a distance function between vectors. Specifically here, this is a distance function in the t-space. The key thing is that k of xz can be measured directly in the original space without explicitly writing the t representation of x and z. And this is what I'm going to show now. So again, notice that we are working in a 3 to the n monomial space. And the theorem that I'm going to prove now is that k of xz, which is the dot product between t of z and t of x in the ti space, can be computed this way. It's really 2 to the same xz, where same xz is the number of features that have the same value in x and in z. So even before we convince ourselves that this is correct, notice that this is a good thing. Because rather than computing a dot product in the 3 to the n large space, I'm just looking at the original x and z. They are in the n-dimensional space. I'm looking at how many of their bits are the same, and I know the value of this dot product. So you can at least, without understanding why this is true, you can appreciate that this is important. Okay? Okay, so now why is this true? Anyone can try to give an argument? Let's look at, okay, this is just another way to write a function. Let's think about this example. Let's assume that n is 3. And I'm looking at these two examples. This is the example I care about. And this is one of the examples on which I made a mistake, and I'm going to compute it. I'm going to use it as my example. So because n is 3, I'm going to compute monomials of size 0. That means the empty function. Everything is on. Monomials of size 1, 2, and 3. And look at x and z here. And let's think about which monomials computed over x are going to be alive also when I compute monomials over z. Okay? So for example, let's look at x, the last dimension here, x3 and z3. They are both 1. So one of the monomials is going to be x3. Is x3 going to be on in the representation of x? Yes. Right? x3 of x is going to be 1. x3 of z is also going to be 1. Right? So they are going to contribute 1 to the dot product. You see? What about x1? x1 of x is 0 here, so it's not going to contribute anything. What about not x1? Not x1 is on here. Not x1 of x is 1. Not x1 of z is also 1. So this is going to be contributing 1 to the dot product. So basically what we have to think about is what are the monomials that will be 1 on both sides, because they will contribute something to the dot product. So here is one way to think about it. Let's assume that k is the number of bits that are common to x and z. I'm going to construct a surviving monomial that will survive the dot product, will be on here and here in the following way. I'm going to choose to include one of these k literals with the right polarity in the monomial. So for these k things that are the same, I'm going to put them in my monomial. And I'm arguing that these monomials that consist of things that are one of these k, any combination of them, they're going to be on both sides. And therefore, all the subsets of k are going to be there. On the other hand, if I involve, for example, x2 in my monomial, it's not going to agree. Well, if I put x2 to be 1, this guy, monomials on this side are going to be on, but monomials on this side are going to be off. So the dot product will disappear. If I include x2 negation, here it's going to be on, and here it's going to be off. The dot product will disappear. Let's look at a concrete example here, now, just to make sure that we understand this. So here is the example. So red here means negation. So I'm looking at these two examples, and I'm looking at these two monomials. So the monomial x1 not x3 of 0, 0, 1 is the same as not x1, x3 of 0, 1, 1. They're both 1. And therefore, in the dot product, this monomial is going to survive. And I'm arguing that all subsets of this monomial are also going to survive. That is, not x1 is going to survive. Not x1 of this is equal to not x1 of this. x3 of 0, 0, 1 is equal to x3 of 0, 1, 0. And the null is always on. And that's it. Only these four are going to survive. Because if I put something else into the monomial, there's going to be disagreement between its value on 0, 0, 1 and its value on 0, 1, 1. And therefore, the dot product will be 0 in this component. Everyone agrees with this? So we proved this important thing. This is just an example here, right? I didn't do anything general. I just gave one very generic and important example, but just an example that shows that if I want to compute the dot product between these two huge vectors, I actually don't need to touch these huge vectors. It's sufficient for me to look carefully at the original points, x and z, and I can compute the dot product there. Questions? What's there? Z is just an example. Another example. So notice this. We showed in the previous slides that in order to compute, let me just give context, that in order to compute this function, that is f of x, right? So you give me x. I learned yesterday a function. I want to compute f of x, my prediction, right? What is my prediction? It's just the threshold function over this linear sum. What did I show today? This is what you knew last time, the last few meetings. Today I showed that in order to compute this f of x, you can do it this way. You can compute it by doing a sum over the examples, not the weight vector. Here it was a sum over the weights. Here it's a sum over examples of dot product between x, the one you care about now, and all these that you've seen before and made mistakes on, right? So I moved from a sum over weights to a sum over examples. That was just an exercise in algebra. Everyone agrees that we show that? Now I show you, okay, you want to compute this. It's going to cost you, because this k of xz is really a dot product between x and z. You're going to do this many times, right? How many times you're going to compute this dot product? One for each element in M. But I'm just showing you how to compute it once. How to compute it once. You can either do a dot product here, or you can compute this. That's what I proved. And I suggest that you do this because that's going to be much faster. Okay? So really two steps. Step one, showing that you can replace a sum over W's with a sum over examples. That's the dual space transformation. Two, I'm showing you that the sum over M or each element in the sum over M can be computed efficiently. Okay, so let's, so here I show that it can compute it. Now here is another example for you to play with at home, just to make sure these concepts are completely understood. So again, I'm just writing here the dual representation. Take X to be 4-dimensional space. Compute I as the monomial space. 81 elements, right? 3 to the 4. You don't have to write all of them down. Just start writing it so you'll make sure that you understand, and we're talking about the same thing. You should get 81. Take 2 examples, right? Again, you have to do it many times, not only for 2 examples, right? For all pairs X with some other Z. But I'm giving you an example where X is this, and I'm just choosing one of the Z's. And again, you can do it in 2 ways. One way is write down I of X. It's going to be a vector of size 81. I of Z is going to be a vector of size 81. Don't write it down. Just make sure that you know how to write it down. And specifically, write down, imagine that you want to write eventually the dot product between these 2 vectors. So make sure you write down those components in the dot product that will match and contribute to the dot product. Those components in the vector that will contribute to the dot product. Once you do this, you can compute I of X dot product with I of Z. That's one option. Option 2, compute this. And convince yourself that when you do this, you get the same number. Okay? So this will be an exercise in understanding the key idea in kernel tricks. Now, you can invent another kernel. For example, you can invent for yourself a kernel where I is not the space of all monomials, but rather all the space of all monomials of size 3, exactly 3. Okay? It's going to be another space, size about n cubed, or 4 cubed here. But still, you can do the same trick there, and you can figure out what will be the shortcut. Okay, so as I said, this is an example. Now we want to generalize it. And before we generalize it, let's just summarize what is the algorithm that we developed here. We developed a dual representation of perceptron. We simply run perceptron in an online mode. Instead of keeping the weights, keeping track of the weights as we typically do, now we're going to keep track of the set M of all examples on which we've made mistakes, right? So this really gives us S of Z, right, which is plus or minus 1, depending on which type of mistake we've made. And we're going to remember these P and D, and that's it. Whenever you give me an X and ask me, compute the value of your current hypothesis on X, I'm going to look at my M, all examples that I tried so far and made mistakes on. I'm going to compute this K of XZ on all these Z's, and I'm done, and sum over this. Okay? So that's the dual representation of perceptron. Okay, so now let's move to other interesting examples. All of them are going to have the same idea, and I'm going to repeat this idea 2 or 3 times, because this is really the important thing for you to understand. So I want to make predictions with respect to some hyperplane that was produced by perceptron, or if you want, by support vector machines that we'll see in a couple of weeks. And we know, because I showed you this dual representation thing, that this prediction can be computed as a function of dot products of feature-based representation of examples, right? This dot product between X and Z's. So the trick here is going to be that I need to compute this dot product in a high-dimensional space as follows. Given 2 examples, X and Y now, I want to map them to a high-dimensional space. I'm going to give you another example of a quadratic mapping. So instead of x, xn, 1x, xn, I'm going to include quadratic terms. So I'm going to include, I'm including 1, just the empty term, all the xi's, all the xi squares, and all the mixed terms. That's my new representation, a lot more expressive, right? And I'm doing this for y. Now, one option, as I said, is to compute this dot product. If I can compute this dot product, I can learn linear separators in this new space. Instead, this is going to cost me, something that is like n squared. Instead, I'm arguing that I can work in the original space. In this case, this is how I'm going to work in the original space. I'm going to just compute the dot product of x and y, add 1, and square it. Much cheaper, right? So this is an n-dimensional thing. This is an n-square dimensional thing. The theorem is that A is equal to B. This is the kernel trick theorem instantiated here. In fact, I'm cheating a little bit because for this to be really equal, I should have put square root of 2 as coefficients here. You know this. You've known this in, I don't know, middle school. Just x plus y all square. But it doesn't matter really what are the coefficients because I'm going to send this to my perceptron. It doesn't matter whether I initialize the features with square root of 2 coefficient on some of them. Perceptron will learn the weight. So just to understand this, it's cleaner for me to write it this way rather than to put some coefficients. But this is the theorem, right? The theorem is that you can compute it either in the blown up space or in the original space. And it's the same. Saying this again. You want to work with degree 2 polynomials as your features. Then your dot product will be in the space of this dimensionality, right? N choose 2, n squared. The kernel tricks allows you to save and compute dot product in an n-dimensional space instead. That's it. Of course, what are K's? I mean, can I always do this? And the answer is that you cannot always do it, but you can do it in a lot of interesting cases. So a function k of xz is a valid kernel if it corresponds to an inner product, a dot product, in some high-dimensional space. Right? This is actually what we did, right? We kind of started it in the other direction. We started with a dot product in a high-dimensional space and showed that we can do it as a kernel. Now I'm arguing it in the other direction. And here is another example, another quadratic kernel. My kernel is the dot product of x and z squared. Notice that it's a little bit different than the one I had before. Here I had the dot product plus 1. It's a little bit different, but both of them will have quadratic terms. And in order to show you that this is indeed a kernel, I'm going to show you that there exists a high-dimensional space in which this kernel can be written as a dot product. What is going to be this high-dimensional space? You know it's going to be something with quadratic terms. And let's just do the algebra. So I'm computing k of xz, which is this guy. It's just this dot product. This is the dot product, square. Opening this up. And now let's do some imagination here. And you can see that I can decompose this as the dot product of this vector with this vector. Okay? So I showed you that k of xz can be written as a dot product in an expanded space. This is the expanded space. Okay? So we did the transformation now in two directions. We started with k and wrote it as a dot product in the high-dimensional space, or we started with a high-dimensional space and showed that there is a trick and you don't need to do it in the high-dimensional space. And this is really exactly the example I started with, right? This is the kernel you need in order to run perceptron and learn this function. Okay, so now in real life, you don't necessarily need to figure out what is this phi if you want to use a kernel. There are some property that you can prove directly on K, and it's guaranteed, if these properties are satisfied, that this phi exists, even if you don't know how to write it down. And basically, these general properties go through constructing a matrix of K of xi zj for all examples that you have. You have a training set, just compute a matrix of all the values xi, comma, zj via the kernel. This is going to be called the gray matrix. And if this gray matrix satisfies some properties, specifically if it's positive semi-definite, then we know that this phi exists. We don't need to worry. This is really not that important from your perspective, because you're going to use typically kind of generic kernels. But just to get some understanding of what's happening, this is the gray matrix. As I said, it's just you compute the dot product, the kernel for each pair of examples. Notice that this only depends on how many examples you have, not on the dimensionality. And if this matrix satisfies some conditions, and I'm writing these conditions here, then everything is going to be okay. Right? So there is a phi that corresponds to it. Okay, so I'm not going to go into this condition exactly. All the definitions are here if you want to understand it. It's basically, this matrix has to be positive semi-definite. More importantly is that there's a lot of interesting examples and interesting properties that allow you to expand your collection of kernels. We started with some polynomial kernels. So linear kernel is a polynomial kernel of degree 1, which basically says K of xz is just the dot product of xz. This is what we were doing yesterday before we learned about kernels. This is saying don't expand the feature space. Polynomial kernel of degree d is just xz dot product to the d, and you can also do xz plus c, or plus 1 to the d, which gives you all the intermediate degrees. Right? So we actually showed these two examples for d equal 2 before. Yeah? Because we want to solve this example. So if I give you examples from this space, and you run perceptron, you will not be able to learn. You agree? So what I'm doing is I'm expanding my feature space. And in this new expanded feature space, we will be able to learn this function, because it will become linear in the new expanded space. And all I'm doing today, and this is something that you knew before today's lecture, that I can expand the feature space and linearize function. What I'm showing you today is that there are two ways to expand the feature space. One is explicit. Take x1 up to xn and write it down, for example, for this case, as all squares. Or use a quadratic kernel, which is this guy, and run perceptron, what we call the dual perceptron, the algorithm from a few slides ago, with these kernels, and it's also going to learn this circle. Oh. Excellent question. How do I know which kernel to use? It's the same question that you could have asked last week. How do I know which feature space to use? Right? I don't. I have to have some understanding of the problem, or I can try, run my original feature space with my favorite linear function, we know, see that I actually can't learn a lot, right? I'm not expressive enough. And that means that I have to expand my feature space. And then I'm going to try quadratic features. And I'm going to learn. And I'm going to see if this is good enough. And if not, I'm going to expand further. So really, there is no theory today for what will be the best feature space beyond looking at what happens and trying it. Of course, you can choose not to use linear functions. You can use decision trees. They will do it for you, right? They don't ask you what expansion you need to do. They're supposed to learn it from the data. Or, as we'll see in a week or so, you can also use neural network that also don't ask you. Now, each one of these families comes with some caveats, but they address this question without the need for trial and error. Well, they need other trials and error, but not this trial and error. Yes?
So the kernels can apply to
Again, the example of the circle would be something that you should keep in mind. If it so happens that this is how your data looks, right? So you're after a quadratic function, then you cannot learn it with a linear function. You will have to use some way of expanding your feature space. And this is a way of expanding the feature space. Okay, so these are two examples that we've seen before. Now, once you have a kernel, there are very simple operations that you can run on kernels, and I'm just kind of listing a few of them. All of them are very, very easy to prove directly from the definition. So if you take as your definition, this is a kernel because I know how to write it as a dot product in a d-dimensional space, right, which was one of the definitions I gave, and we've seen it for d equal 2. Take this as your definition, and then you will be able to convince yourself that each of the operators that I'm showing now is also a kernel. For example, I can take a kernel and multiply it by a constant. Now, if you could write this as a dot product in some feature space, you'll convince yourself that you can write this one on the right side also as a dot product. If k is a kernel, I can multiply k by a function applied to x and to x prime, and it's also a kernel. If k is a kernel, a polynomial of k, where p is this polynomial, is also a kernel. And e to the kernel is also a kernel. And again, these are really simple manipulations that you can convince yourself you can do it for one of them. Summing kernels is also a kernel. Multiplying kernels is also a kernel. If phi of x is a vector in R of m, and this is a kernel over points in R to the m, then k of phi is also a kernel. And if A is a symmetric positive semi-definite matrix, and K is a kernel, this is a valid kernel also. So there are a few other things that you can say, but basically it's easy to construct new kernels once you have one. So everything we talked about so far, all the examples I've given, are actually discrete kernels, right? So you start with a discrete feature space, you do some transformation, you run with it. You can also think about continuous kernels. So here is another kernel that is called Gaussian kernels, or sometimes you'll see it as radial base function kernels. K of xz is e to the minus x minus e to some power, 2 over c. So what does this mean? Essentially, we can always think about kernel as a distance metric between x and z in some space. And here it's very easy for you to see. Let's just forget this c here. Let's think about it as 2 for a second and look at these two statements. If x and z are very close together, that's going to be 1, say, or a large number, right? Because this is going to be 0, so it's e to the 0, 1. If x and z are very far away, x minus z squared, x minus z is going to be very large, e to the minus something very large, it's going to be 0. So essentially, it's a Gaussian, right? You take 2 points that are close together, you get a value. As the points, are farther away, you go to 0. And you can also play with C here. You can think about it as standard deviation, but really, again, think about it. If C is very small, you're going to get that every item is similar only to itself, right? Because C is very small, this is going to be very large. If C is very large, essentially you get 1 for everything. All the values are the same. All the independent of what x and z you put here, you get the same value. So you can play with this Gaussian different way, but the important thing is that it's a matrix, it's a kernel. So why is this a kernel? We can actually prove it from first principle using the transformation that I showed before. So I'm going to write this here. K of xz, this is the definition. I'm going to just write this down explicitly. X squared plus z squared minus 2xz. And then I'm just opening this. So it's e to something, e to something, e to something, the product of them. This is a kernel. Why is this a kernel? Because xz is a kernel. I can multiply it by something, and I can exp a kernel. These are 2 of the transformations I mentioned the 2 slides before. So that's why this is a kernel. And then I can multiply it by a function of x and a function of z, another transformation I mentioned the slide before, and therefore this is a kernel. Okay, so the only difference, and it's an important difference, between this and a discrete kernel is that when I gave you a discrete kernel, it was just an algebra exercise. You could either use the kernel, or you could blow up explicitly the feature space. It's exactly the same thing. Nothing changes in terms of the function that you're learning. Nothing changes in terms of learnability or generalization. Everything is the same. It just, the algebra is different. Here it's a little bit different because here you have a continuous representation, so I cannot say in an easy way that I can explicitly blow up the feature space to get to an identical representation, right? Although there is work that shows that you can kind of do this, but it's a little bit less trivial than what I've done before, where these 2 things are just identical. Okay, so let's summarize. What have we done? We have rewritten f of x, linear separator, instead of as a function of weights, dot product in the weight space, as a dot product in the example space. That's what we've done. So it's a method to run perceptron on a very large feature space without incurring the cost of keeping a very large weight vector. Instead, we incur the cost of keeping examples, those examples on which we've made mistakes. But we've showed that sometimes we can actually compute this dot product in a very efficient way, and therefore it's worthwhile to do this duality. Again, importantly, it pertains only to efficiency. It doesn't change anything else. And also importantly is that there are many, many algorithms that can be, where you can use kernels. Importantly, we're going to talk about support vector machines. We talked about perceptron, but others. You can do kernel PCAs. I'm going to mention it briefly at the end. And you can do Gaussian models, and you can use kernels for this. Okay, so just a few last comments. So clearly there is a trade-off between the computational efficiency and generalization ability in general of classifiers. So this is what's known about this issue of kernels. So we know that you don't always want to say, you know what, I don't know which function I'm going to learn, and therefore I'm just going to use kernels and learn in this space. Not a good idea, because maybe the function that you want to learn is actually a simple one, and you really effectively are blowing up your feature space and learning in a much more expressive function space. You're going to pay for it. And you can actually prove this, right? So there are cases where you could have learned with perceptron in the linear space, in the original space, and if you use kernels, you're going to make exponential cost. It's going to cost you exponentially. By the way, in these papers, if you're interested, you can also see an argument for why you cannot use kernels for multiplicative learning algorithms like we know. If you could have learned almost everything. And next week, we'll see that we cannot, well, in fact, this week, we cannot learn everything under some well-defined notion of can learn. In addition, so this is one aspect. You know, you don't always want to move to the kernel space. In addition, there is an issue of efficiency. It's not always clear that you actually want to move to the dual space. And I'm going to give you an example of kind of just hand-wavy example of a rough intuition when you want to do it and when you don't want to do it. So let's look at it this way. So let's assume that we have two spaces. I have m examples, and T1 and T2 are the sizes of the spaces that I have. T1 is the dual space, and T2 is the primal space, right? So I started with T2, and I blew it up to T1. So T1 is going to be, the other way around, I guess. T2 is the blown up space, and T1 is the original space. Okay, so what happens in the dual space? I'm going to, every time when I touch an example, I'm going to touch T1 features, but I'm going to do it m squared times because I'm going to touch all pairs of examples, right? When I work in the dual space, I touch pairs of examples every time. So it's going to cost me about T1 times m squared. On the other hand, if I'm in the primal space, just running perceptron as is, it's going to cost me T2 every example, but I'm going to touch every example once. So it's about T2m. And here you can see the trade-off, right? So if what you care about is the ratio between T1 and T2 and its relations to m. If m is very, very large, a lot of examples, you don't want to work in the dual space. If m is small, you want to work in the dual space. Okay? So that's kind of a rule of thumb. And indeed, in many applications, specifically in natural language processing applications, where typically you have a lot of examples, what people prefer is to blow up the feature space explicitly and stay in the primal, run the standard perceptron on the blown feature space, rather than move to the dual space and use a kernel. And this is exactly the reason. You have a lot of examples. You much rather blow up your feature space, but still be linear with the number of examples, rather than don't blow up the feature space and be quadratic in the number of examples. That's kind of the trade-off. So in many cases, even when you see in papers we've used kernels, often what they do is they think about their feature space as kernelized, but they do it explicitly. They don't use a kernel. They actually say, oh, I'm going to use a quadratic kernel, but really what they do is they use it as a way to model the problem or think about the type of features they want, but really they'll explicitly blow it up. Let me just finish. I have two more slides I want to... Okay, so as I said, there's another issue with kernels that is important for you to realize. Kernels blow up the feature space and, in some sense, make it very easy to blow up the feature space. Sometimes you want to think a little bit more carefully, how do I want to blow up the feature space? For example, if you want to add quadratic terms, do you really want to add all the quadratic terms? Think about sentences. Okay, if your features are, say, bag of words from a sentence, and you want to include conjunctions of words, 2 words, conjunctions of them. You can do, if you include a quadratic kernel, it means that you take all possible conjunctions of words, right? But you may know that you don't really need all conjunctions of words. You just need all conjunctions of words that are within a small window of each other, or maybe just consecutive words. All right, so this is a very restricted way of blowing up the dimensionality. That could be better. So you have to be very, very careful in how you use this blowing up dimensionality trick. And in the last slide, which I'm not going to go over now because it's time, I'm giving, again, a hand-wavy argument that I'm going to start with next time of why it's better for you to be careful here. Okay, last question.
So you do space and
Yeah, in terms, when I'm talking about discrete features, they have exactly the same results. It's the same function that I'm writing in 2 different ways. And that's important to understand. Okay, we're done for today. See you on Thursday.
Continuous kernels, if you had infinite samples, then they would be the same, right?
Yes.
Because then it expands to an infinite Hilbert space. And it's
Right,
free.
right.
Okay, recoverable.
And